A few weeks ago, Elgato kindly sent me the latest capture cards, the 4K X and the 4K Pro. I've been really impressed with them so far and will be publishing a review on these capture cards soon. It should be no surprise that the 4K X is the follow-up to the hugely popular HD60 X, as they look identical. The only real difference is the HDMI in and HDMI out ports have swapped sides. The Elgato HD60 X was released in April 2022, and I've been using the card over the last 2 years to record games footage, record from cameras, and record screen recordings from laptops, Raspberry Pis, and more. Unfortunately, I never got round to publishing a review of the Elgato HD60 X, so I would like to rectify that in this video and give you my thoughts on this capture card and talk about what this card is capable of and whether it remains a good purchase in 2024. The HD60 X is the follow-up to the HD60S Plus, which itself was a follow-up to the HD60S. I am familiar with this whole series of capture cards as I've owned and used all of them over the last several years. In fact, I still own 2 HD60S Plus capture cards. The HD60X looks physically different to the older HD60S Plus, but many specifications are similar. Both cards utilise a USB 3.0 5 gigabits per second Type-C connection and feature a 3.5mm line in port, an HDMI input and an HDMI output. They both support 4K recording at 30 frames per second and high dynamic range recording at 1080p 60. High dynamic range, which is commonly shortened to HDR, allows a wider range of colours and brightness levels to be used, making games look more vibrant. It's a great feature, but it is worth noting that HDR recording is only possible with the HD60X using a Windows computer. The HD60X introduced support for playing games with variable refresh rates and improved support for other pass-throughs such as 1440p 120 and 1080p 240. It also added support for recording at 1440p 60 and 1080p 120. This was a game changer for me as it allowed me to play first-person shooters like Call of Duty at 1440p up to 120 frames per second and record the game at 1440p at 60 frames per second. Support for variable refresh rates means that I don't have to define a fixed frame rate in my game, which is something I had to do in older Elgato capture cards in order to record game footage correctly. As with all Elgato products, the HD60 X comes packaged in an easy to open box. Simply tear from the tab on the top of the box and slide out the internal box. When you open up the internal box, you will see the Elgato HD60 X. On one side, it has HDMI out, a Type-C USB port and HDMI in. On the other side, there is a power indicator and the 3.5mm audio port. The box also includes a 1.8 meter long Type A to Type C USB cable, a 1.5 meter long HDMI 2.0 cable, an Elgato sticker, and a short safety instructions manual. Setting up the HD60X is simple. All you have to do is connect the HDMI cable from your games console or games PC into the HDMI in port. Then connect an HDMI cable from HDMI out to the monitor you are going to be playing games on. Next, connect the HD60X to your computer using the provided Type-C to Type-A USB cable, ensuring that the Type-A port on your computer supports USB 3.0 or above. If you wish, you can also record game chat audio using the 3.5mm analog audio port. If you're a Windows user, you should then download the 4K Capture Utility app from the Elgato Downloads page. Mac users should download the Capture Device Utility app. In 4K Capture Utility, you can access your device settings by clicking on the settings cog at the top right hand corner of the app. In this area, you can check for software updates, configure your device, adjust your video image and colours, and configure recording and mic settings. When you're setting things up for the first time, be sure to select the Device tab to check that you're on the latest version that is available for your HD60X. In contrast, Mac users have a simpler solution with Capture Device Utility that does have the most important settings you will need, such as firmware version, audio input, HDMI colour range, and input EDID mode. It's worth noting that whilst Elgato's software is used to update the HD60X firmware, The device itself is a Universal Video Class device, or UVC device, which means that it is plug and play. In my own recording setup, for example, I use a variety of Elgato cards with my Sony cameras, and they're all available in video conferencing apps as webcams. So whilst there is no official Elgato software available for Linux, the HD60 X is still compatible with Linux operating systems, and you could use it to record games through something like OBS and Linux. You would just need to access Windows or Mac to ensure that you've updated your device to the latest firmware. So whilst there is no official Elgato software available for Linux, the HD60 X is still compatible with Linux operating systems. So in a Linux setup, you could connect the HD60 X and use something like OBS to connect a camera or a games console, and it would work just the same way it would on Windows or Mac. You would still need access to Windows or Mac, however, to ensure you've updated your device to the latest firmware. Even in 2024, the HD60 X supports recording and streaming at the resolutions and frame rates that most gamers will use. This table shows the input formats and capture formats that the Elgato HD supports using a standard 16:9 aspect ratio. These values would be lower if you're attempting to record larger ultra-wide resolutions and larger aspect ratios, such as 21:9. As you can see, if you play a game at 4K 60, you can record at 4K 30, 1440p 60 and 1080p 60. If you play a game at 1440p 120, you can record up to 1440p 60, 1080p 120 or 1080p 60. And if you play a game at 1080p with a high refresh rate up to 240 FPS, you can record at 1080p 120 or 1080p 60. Lower resolutions such as 720p, 576p and 480p are supported too. I've not had any major problems recording with the HD60 X. It's a very easy device to use. But I have come across a weird recording issue which others appear to have faced too. I've been mostly gaming on the Xbox Series X over the last year or so, and the ideal setup for me is to play at 1440p 120 and record at 1440p 60. However, out of the box, I could not select 1440p 120 on my Xbox when I was connected to the HDX. I could only select 4K or 1080p. Thankfully, I managed to find a solution to this problem on Reddit. To resolve this issue, you need to open up Elgato's capture software and switch input EDID mode or EDID mode to internal, and then upload a custom EDID file that Elgato shared with a Redditor. For reference, EDID or EDID stands for Extended Display Identification Data. When a custom EDID has been uploaded, it will be available in the settings area for future use, as 4K Capture Utility takes a note of where the EDID bin file is located. If you want to remove the custom EDID, simply move or delete the file from that location, and it will no longer be shown in the drop-down list. Other EDID files can be found in the installation folder of 4K Capture Utility. This workaround solution did work for me when recording at 1440p, but I discovered this configuration displays weird graphical glitches at the top of the image when recording at a different resolution such as 4K. So you need to remember to change your configuration back when you're not recording at 1440p. I don't consider this to be a major problem as a workaround is available, but I'm a little puzzled as to why this problem has not yet been resolved with a firmware update, as Elgato are aware of the issue. What I'd like to talk about now is high dynamic range, because it's an exciting feature and it's one of the selling points of the HD60 X. If you look closely at the supported resolutions table, you will notice the HDR recording restricts what format you can play games in and what you can record at. It only supports HDR recording at 1080p 60, and this recording option forces you to play games at either 4K 60 or 1080p 60. This was a little disappointing to me initially, as I like to play first-person shooters at high frame rates, and if I want to record using HDR, I need to play games at only 60 frames per second. However, the HD60 X does support HDR tone mapping, which means that if it does detect an HDR input, it can map the wider range of colours and brightness levels that HDR offers to the standard dynamic range. It's important to stress that HDR tone mapping doesn't mean that you're recording a true HDR image. What you're doing is trying to recreate that vibrant HDR image in standard dynamic range. And in practice, the quality of tone mapping will change from game to game, so you may have to apply filters in order to make things look better. For me, that is a price worth paying. It's a minor inconvenience in my opinion, as it allows you to play games in HDR on your monitor, and you can record the footage using a wide variety of resolutions and frame rates. In other words, you're not limited to recording at 1080p 60, and you're not limited to playing games at 4K 60 or 1080p 60. Tone mapping is enabled by default, but the setting is initially hidden in 4K Capture Utility, though you can make the setting available by holding the Control key when you click on the settings cog at the top right hand side of the app. You do not have to perform this step on Capture Device Utility on Mac, as the HDR tone mapping setting is always available. Now, tone mapping is something that most people will keep enabled, but you can disable it if you wish, and it's something you might want to do if you prefer to do tone mapping via OBS or via a video editor such as DaVinci Resolve. HDR can drastically improve the image, but as I hinted at earlier, it can also make the image look terrible if you don't set things up correctly. If your config settings aren't right, the image may look incredibly dark, or you may end up with the image colors looking, well, really weird. I've recorded hours of footage over the last few weeks to review things, and in practice, I found that certain games look great right out of the box, but with others, I found I had to adjust the image brightness and saturation levels so it didn't look all washed out. If you look online, you'll see that many game streamers tackle this issue using OBS filters and lookup table filters, which are commonly called LUTs. You'll find many tutorials on how to do this on YouTube, so I recommend following these as a starting point for your own configuration and your own filter setup. Throughout this video, you have seen game footage that was recorded at 4K at 30 frames per second, but most gamers will record and stream games at higher frame rates such as 60 frames per second. Recording at higher frame rates should help make game footage look smoother, but of course you need to play around with settings to find the sweet spot for you. So if you purchase the HD60 X, I encourage you to test different input and capture resolutions and different frame rates and try features such as HDR. I also recommend uploading some of your test footage online, as the compression process that YouTube, Twitch and other video platforms use will reduce the quality of the image. This will help you see exactly what your viewers will see. In this video, I've spoke about the Elgato HD60 X, its specifications, its features, and I've touched upon what you can do with this card. What I'd like to do in this final section is give you my overall opinion on this card and touch upon some things that I've spoke about in this video which I think are relevant. I still think that the Elgato HD60 X, which you see here, is still a fantastic capture card solution in 2024, and I think it will be for the next few years. I bought this shortly after launch, so it was a few months after it came out a few years ago, or 2 years ago, and it's been so reliable for me. I've used it for recording games footage, recording footage from cameras, recording footage from laptops and different things I was testing as well. And one of the reasons that I still love this card is that it's been so reliable. It's never given me any problems when recording. I've never lost footage. I don't have any issues with latency, with audio being out of sync with the video, with anything, audio dropping or anything like that. It's always just worked for me, and that's one of the reasons why I love it. Now, right now, I am recording with my Panasonic camera, which I always call my main camera, and it has an HDMI cable that goes round and it's plugged into the Elgato HD60 X right now. So I've been showing you lots of game footage in this video that was recorded with the Elgato HD60 X, but what you're watching right now is footage from my camera being recorded with this capture card, which is a reminder that, yes, all of these capture cards, which I've got here, all these Elgato capture cards, they're marketed and they're sold as game capture devices. And that's true, that's what they're for, and that's what most people buy them for. But these are fantastic video capture card solutions for recording cameras as well, footage from cameras. And that's how I use them in my recording setup as well. I've got, the older HD60S Pluses up there, recording from my overhead camera, etc. And that's how I use them. I use all of these Elgato capture cards in one way or another. If I'm not recording games footage with them, I'll hook up a camera with them and I'll use them. They're just so flexible in that way. And it's one of the reasons why I love working with these. I don't have any issues with drivers or anything like that. They just work. As always, it's important to do your research before you spend any money. And price is obviously going to be a factor. Your budget will determine whether you purchase the latest and greatest capture cards, such as the 4K X or 4K Pro, or whether you save a little money and go back a year or two and get something that's still functional, still reliable, and still pretty impressive. Or whether maybe you want to save even more money and go many years further back. But whatever you choose to do, your budget will be a factor when you're deciding to buy a capture card. Now, when it comes to features and specifications, for me, there's two things to consider, two factors to consider. And I think this is what most people should consider as well. Firstly, the resolutions and frame rates that you're going to be playing your games at. And secondly, the resolutions and frame rates that you're going to be recording or streaming games at. And it's important to realize that those are two different things, because you generally can play games at a higher frame rate, but the recording is at a lower frame rate or a lower resolution. Now, if, like me, you like first-person shooters, you want a capture card that supports the ability to play games at higher frame rates. If you're playing retro games, if you're playing simple platformer games, it's not really as important. Now, from a recording point of view, it's quite incredible that this can record up to 120 frames per second. That's recording, not just playing. This can record up to 120 frames per second. And the newer capture cards can record higher frame rates, like up to 240 frames per second. That is incredible. But there is an asterisk there. The reality is that most video platforms only support recording or streaming at 60 frames per second. For example, the maximum bit rate on Twitch is 6 megabits per second, which is why most people opt to stream games at 1080p at 60 frames per second. YouTube supports much higher bit rates, such as 40 megabits per second, so it's possible to stream at 1440p or 4K at up to 60 frames per second. Of course, you do need a more powerful computer and a faster internet connection to support publishing videos and streaming games at those higher resolutions and frame rates. Please also be aware that whilst YouTube supports HDR recording, Twitch does not. You can, however, use tone mapping to convert your video image from HDR to SDR before you upload to either platform. For the average game streamer, the Elgato HD60 X still ticks most boxes, but it has been out for 2 years, and Elgato have just released 2 new capture card solutions this year. And these both support HDMI 2.1 instead of HDMI 2.0. And they both support playing games at high resolutions and frame rates. And they both support recording and streaming video footage, games or camera footage at high resolutions and frame rates. So they are more capable. But to circle back, the HD60 X is probably still the smart buy for most people, because it does everything that you need it to do, but at a lower price point. All these new features are amazing, but ultimately, if you're not going to use them, kind of pointless. So for most people, this will be the smart buy, but I have to put an asterisk on that and talk about price again, because here in the UK right now, the Elgato 4K X is retailing at £229.99, so £230. And right now, today, as I speak, the older Elgato HD60 X is £189.99, so £190. So today, if I was buying a brand new capture card from Elgato and I was choosing between the 4K X or the Elgato HD60 X, I wouldn't think twice. I would go for the 4K X because it's only £30 more right now, and you get all those new features and specifications, support for higher resolutions and frame rates. So price is going to be a factor. That's a smart buy, but right now with the prices that the way they are, I would go for the 4K X. But things may change. Even before the 4K X and the 4K Pro came out, over the last year, the Elgato HD60 X has dropped to as low as £129.99, £100 cheaper. So if we see that same kind of price difference again, where the Elgato HD60 X is £130 and the 4K-X is $230, then yes, if money's no concern, buy the more expensive one, buy the 4K-X. But if we see that price difference again, I would go for the Elgato HD60 X. I think that would be the smart buy for most people. But the asterisk here, the thing you have to remember is that it's only if it's at that lower price point. Obviously, comes a point where it's worth paying a little bit extra to get all the latest and greatest features. I hope you've all enjoyed watching this review of the Elgato HD60 X, a capture card solution that came out 2 years ago, but one that still performs incredibly well. Please also stay tuned for my review of the Elgato 4K-X and 4K Pro. These cards came out this year, and Elgato were very kind enough to send them out to me for testing. I want to spend the next few weeks testing these before I publish a video, and in that video I will give you my opinion on these cards. As always, please do leave a comment. I love to hear from you guys, so please leave a comment below and let me know what you think of the Elgato HD60 X and how it performs in 2024. Until next time, take care.